law, politics, and finance. And his paper is normally apprehension is Indian data may not be suitable to the high quality research journals, or high quality research journals may not publish the papers on the basis of Indian data. But he has broken that ceiling is broken. In Journal of Finance, a single author paper on the impact of SURFACE has been published and how the corporate firm behavior changes with reference to introduction of the security creditor rights. And this is really a phenomenal achievement for both. One is we are teaching something to the world. We have something to showcase that a SURFACE Act and post-SURFACE Act, what is their evidence. Second, we have showcased that Indian database, which is being used, Provis database has been used, and we can refer this. Researchers have a great advantage whenever they are sending the papers. So papers are already published and use this Provis data. So flexibility has paved the way for the other researchers to continue their work on the basis of the available database. And this is what his work relating to his other papers also published in all well-rated journals: Journal of Finance, Review of Financial Studies, American Economic Review, and all these top-class journals. So I'm very happy and grateful to Professor Vikrant being here. And tomorrow he agreed to discuss with our PhD students also, as mentioned by Rishikesh Krishnan in the welcome address, that our people are working in the area of creditor rights, bankruptcy, protection of the default, and other related issues. So I'm sure his interactions would be greatly helpful to all of us. Thanks, Professor Vikrant. Once again, thanks are not sufficient enough, but we have no other words. His flight is delayed by 6 hours at Chicago and just moving around in the airport, and connecting flight is also delayed. So we all know all these logistics issues. In spite of all that one, he has taken trouble to travel all these 18 to 19 hours to Bangalore, and is really, we are fortunate to have with Professor Vikrant here. Welcome, Professor Vikrant, for this conference and for this. Thank you. I would like to mention Dr. Sudhaker Shukla is with us in this panel. Dr. Sudhaker Shukla is whole-time director of IBBI. He is an economist, MA from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he has been working as he has been in the career of Indian Economic Service. So he must have worked with all Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Planning Commission, earlier Planning Commission, Niti Aayog, and all types of the policy bodies. And currently his contribution is going to this, currently he is contributing this IBBI, and we have been actively associated with his thoughts whenever we interact. His thoughts on these things, policy related issues are very much helpful. It provokes some empirical thoughts, empirical ideas to test those things. Thank you very much, Professor Sudhaker, Dr. Sudhaker, being with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the introductory remarks. May I request Professor Vikrant Vig, Henry D. Bullock, Chaired Professor of Finance, Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University, Illinois, to kindly deliver the keynote address.
All right. Can you all hear me at the back? Yeah. So Thank you, Professor Jayadev, for that very generous introduction. I don't know if I deserve it or not, but you know, it's still always nice to hear good things. So I must add, you know, Professor Jayadev mentioned about the flight delays and stuff like that. I'm a bit jet lagged, so if something is not clear, please do stop me. Do stop me, okay? You know, I don't know what you know, the theme for this talk today is the political economy of financial regulation, but it's going to sort of span a few of the, you know, recent research I've been doing, thinking about, how do rules actually come into play? You know, because when I was starting my sort of, when we were doing our PhD studies, we had this view of some social planner at the background, a benign social planner who's trying to make all these rules, taking into account everybody's welfare. And then when you see the reality, you see a lot of rules are an outcome of a political process, lots of bargaining, and what eventually gets implemented might be, there might be a lot of interest groups that are actually playing an important role out here in making sure, in making sure they get their share. So let me give the broad outline of what this talk is going to be, and then we can get into some of the details out here. Okay, so again, thank you for inviting me for this keynote speech. It's really a privilege to be here. It's my first time in Bangalore, a beautiful campus you have out here. I was reminded this is where Three Idiots was shot, and going around that, I could remember details from that as well. Not clear. Okay. See the. Okay. Is that better? Okay. So I'll touch on two broad sort of interrelated themes. One is going to be on the complexity of the financial system as we see today. Okay, and and the challenge that it may pose to the regulator for the regulators. And then the other thing would be on this globalization, trends of globalization, and we talk about these large banks, multinational firms, the interconnectedness, the externalities of the failures, of one bank failing, and the interconnections might spill over to different economies, and what this implies for how we should think about bankruptcy law in particular, which is the theme of this conference, but also more generally how should we think about regulations. And then the last bit I'll talk a bit about is this political economy of the rule of rulemaking. So the last few decades, what you've seen is you witness an increase in the complexity of the financial system, as I was mentioning earlier. In lockstep, what you've also seen is that the financial regulation has also become more complex. And if you ask people what is driving the complexity of this regulation, and I'll give you some evidence on what it means to be a complex supervisory environment, people say a more complex regulatory system is required because the financial system has got more complex. We need sort of a more a stronger sort of policing in some sense to manage such a system. Okay. And, there are arguments for and favor, the benign argument being this positive argument that they can be market failures and having a good supervisory system can actually take care of that. There's also, of course, a negative side of it, which is a lot of times these regulations are being imposed, these complex regulations are being imposed because the incumbents want to sort of create barriers to entry, and this sort of allows them to earn higher rents. Okay. And so, there are these issues. There's also this issue of reverse causality. Is it the complex financial system generating the complex regulation, or is it the complex regulation that is that is creating this complexity in the financial system, in the sense that, if regulation is very, very, very complex and complicated, and not really necessarily because a lot of times they're an outcome of knee-jerk reactions, then the financial system figures out a way to get around it through financial innovations, but they're nothing but sort of regulatory arbitrage. So we'll spend a bit of time today in thinking about this issue of complexity of the financial system. But we'll also discuss another related theme today, which is what I started with, which is the idea of interconnectedness. Okay, large organizations such as global banks and the interconnectedness and the externalities they create, what does it mean for regulation? So what you may have also noticed is that, you know, with these large interconnected banks, there is this another issue about, in Europe, for example, you see a move towards more harmonization of rules. Okay, so there's this creation in Europe of what are called supranational institutions, all right, which are essentially, at the EU level. And what they're trying to do is taking into account the externalities that might be imposed by one bank failure, for example. They're trying to actually think about, how to design a system for that. But it's also true for, when you think about bankruptcy law, now you have, firms that are operating in multiple countries with oftentimes conflicting jurisdictions, right? How should we think about resolution of distress in such a scenario? This whole idea of extraterritoriality. And so there's going to be some sort of common themes, because earlier when you talk about bankruptcy law within a country, right, one would think about, how should we have a Chapter 11 type procedure, for example, in the US, or some sort of a reorganization procedure, which takes into account these externalities, etc. But now what you have is, you have firms in different countries, and, in some countries like France, labor is senior. In other countries, so there are all sorts of conflicts out there. And because of the interconnectedness, what really happens is distress in one particular area, those laws may not take into account the implications of these distress on these another organizations. So, so Europe is going this other way, which is constructing these centralized supernatural institutions to deal with it, and we sort of try to discuss what that. Now, the arguments for harmonization, etc., are going to be ones that we've encountered, before. The positives being sort of it lowers transaction costs, reduces, I already talked about the negative externalities. Okay, but there are also these negatives. There is a literature that actually, recognizes that there are potential gains to be made from competitive federalism, right? Having these states compete. So Roberto Romano, who's a law professor at the Yale Law School, has talked a lot about competitive federalism as being one of the reasons for the success of some of these things in the US. States competing, trying to attract business, and this can generate, this can be actually a good thing. Of course, there's another side. Again, you'll see, as economists, we can always have this on one hand. On the other hand, there's also another side, which is competition can also generate, instead of race to the top, and generate race to the bottom. Okay, so so I'll talk a bit about using some laboratories, some specific laboratories being the SSM regime in Europe. I'll try and sort of say something on that. I'll spend a bit of time, because this is something I included last minute. A lot of this presentation you'll see is patched, a bit of bit patchy in the sense that I thought I'll arrive here a bit earlier. So I was trying to this morning think about how to actually connect it. But because the theme is bankruptcy, there's another area which I think is very related, where which is the shipping industry, for example, provides a very interesting comparison. All right, I'll talk about it later, but if you look at the shipping industry and you compare it to the airline industry has very, the Cape Town Treaty in the airline industry has generated a set of harmonized rules and regulation. Shipping on the industry, on the other hand, is actually operating on what is called the freedom of contract regime. All right, and it seems quite chaotic, but it actually works remarkably well in many dimensions, and I'll try and sort of bring out that in as well. Okay, so having talked about the complexity of the system, the role for harmonization, I'll sort of end in the last bit in talking about the political economy, more of the rulemaking, which is how these rules are being set. Okay, and I'll sort of bring this, I always talk about this in the US about field hockey and India. I said, if you look at the data on field hockey, 1970s and before that, you see the dominant field hockey players were India, Pakistan. Asia used to be a superpower in field hockey. And you're like, what this is about bankruptcy? Why are you bringing in field hockey out here? But that's how it was. In 1970, what they did was they came up with an innocuous innovation in field hockey, which was they introduced something called AstroTurf. All right. Now this looks like, you know what, if you're good at playing hockey, how does it matter where you actually play hockey? But what it did was, you know, a lot of the Western countries were complaining that, you know, you play on uneven ground, it's not really fair. And therefore, by putting it on AstroTurf, what you'll get is a predictable, you know, movement of the ball, etc. But it created a different pattern in terms of how hockey is played. Because the ground was very unpredictable, it required a lot of dribbling skills. All right, it required different type of skills, and there were different types. You know, India used to do very well on that. Now, AstroTurf came in. It looked like a good surface, but it was an expensive piece of equipment. For a long time, India just had one hockey stadium, which was in Lucknow. And, you know, so this is a costly stadium. It has to, you know, you have special shoes that are needed. This has to be, there's a lot of maintenance that goes with it. And all they were trying to do is just before the Olympics, once the Indian team was finalized, they could practice and play a few matches out there. Compared to another country, which is Netherlands, you know, when India had one of the AstroTurf field, they had AstroTurfs in schools. So if you look at the data out there back, they had 58, 60 AstroTurf where kids are actually playing out there on a regular basis, and India had just one. A lot of times Indian players were actually playing barefooted, so they weren't even used to AstroTurf shoes, and now they have to show up in the Olympics out here. The point I'm going to make is that the simple rule change, which was the introduction of hockey, it shifted this power, is my view, from Asia to Western this thing. And now what you see is, of course, cricket is the most important sport. We do have money now, and we can actually have these AstroTurf stadium. But what we have lost is this whole generation of hockey players, which were passing their talent from one to the other, and this hole has not been able to be filled. So now we have these resources, but we don't really have the personnel, and you know, that sort of stuff. And a lot of it is a theme out here, which is how changing the rules of the game can actually shift. So these things which we think that there is this Basel committee, which is coming up with some bank regulation, is thinking in terms of the goodness of, you know, thinking about welfare, you know, overall, you see how these are an outcome of negotiations between a few players who really understand the process. And then this is sort of force-fed in some ways to others who are taking it as, you know what, well, this is an outcome of intense optimization. If the West is doing it, it must be good. We all must do that. But how changing the rules, just like it shifted the hockey superpower status from Asia, India, there's also this stuff. So there's going to be this stuff of how changing the rules of the game actually, you know, affects how this surplus is created. Okay, I've said a lot on hockey, so let me get to the first of the three things. So remember, I talked about saying something on the complexity of regulation, which will be connected to this discussion we've just had. I'd say briefly in connection to that, I'll talk a bit about, you know, this whole idea of harmonization, centralization of decision making, and the trade-off it involves. Okay, so that, you know, if you want to centralize it, what are the benefits of it, and then what are the costs associated with it? Things that people have seen in economic theory, arguments that people can understand, but trying to bring data to see which force dominates and under which scenario. And finally, it will be about, in a particular context, looking at some leaked documents on how these, the Basel committee members and the regulators are voting on Basel proposals. So there was, you know, RiskNet leaked out some documents and we got access, and we saw the voting patterns, and we saw how rules were not just made out of, you know, discussions just, you know, on what they thought was the right thing, but what the national champions and the big lobby groups in their country were telling them to do. And it was that outcome which determined what got implemented and essentially limits of that. Okay, so lots to talk about, but you know, we'll see where we get with this whole thing. Okay, so I have already sort of hopefully outlined this whole thing. So I'll talk a bit about the complexity, the organizational design, which is this issue of harmonization that I talked about. It's going to be a bit loose in some ways. I won't be able to, you know, touch on everything in a very precise manner, but hopefully it'll give you some food for thought. And finally conclude with this political economy of rulemaking, which is what I talked about. Okay, so I've given argument for the complexity, the trend, the trend towards increasing complexity, the financial system has become very, very complex. You look at global banks, you look at these large banks, people have attributed this sometimes to technology allowing for this. There's all these theories out there. But the important thing is that financial regulation has also become more complex. The rules have become more complex. And the question is, what is driving this complexity in rules? Why have we moved from simple rules to complex rules? And again, to remind you what I said earlier, is this move from simple rules to complex rules just an outcome of the complexity of the financial system? We now are living in a world that is more complex, and therefore we need complex policing. As supervisors, we need more complex systems. Or are there some other forces that are driving it? One being the political economy of it, which is complex rules creating opacity, complex rules creating barriers to entry, and that might favor a set of, if it's a fixed cost type complex rules. If I lobby for a fixed rule, what will the market structure look like? It would disadvantage smaller firms or smaller banks against bigger banks, and what that entails for the market structure that we see out there. Okay, benign versus the malign view. The regulatory capture view of Stigler vis-a-vis the benign Pigouvian view, okay, is what we're going to sort of look at. So I talked about this whole thing on reverse causality, etc. Let me show you in context of bank regulation, because I wanted to sort of bring some data to talk about these things. So here's going to be this is going to be some figures essentially. I'm going to just show you some figures on that, and then we can get into more detailed discussions. But here's an introduction of a sophisticated / complex model-based regulation, which was introduced in 2008, around 2008, okay, to essentially regulate banks. So I don't know how many of you know about capital regulation of banks, but I'd say a few things just to give you the economic intuition of what's really happening. So for many reasons, we think that banks are entities that need to be regulated. That's the starting point of the discussion. The theoretical background of it is bank failures are costly to the society. Just like we talk in terms of in public economics of, a polluting chemical firm, right? The externality problem, right? That the cost to the firm is different from the social cost, and therefore it pollutes too much. Similarly, the idea of externalities here is that banks, when they're deciding how much risk to take, what is optimal from their perspective is not socially optimal. Because once the bank fails, it can actually create it can sort of create, havoc in some sense through these externalities and bring down the whole system. And these externalities are not accounted for. There are also these issues of deposit insurance being provided, which makes debt cheap. Anytime we have a subsidy being awarded to any financial instrument, how would agents respond? They'll take on too much of debt. There could also be some sort of a notion of, well, if we are distressed, we're going to be bailed out, too big to fail type of an argument. And that itself would also generate, okay, whatever the reason is, okay, there was this idea we should regulate banks. And what was done initially was the initial Basel Accord, when it was reduced, was essentially a very simple way of looking at it. So the observation was that firms, if they're left on their own, will take on too much of leverage, too much of debt. Too much of debt means that if the cash flows are volatile, there's a higher chance of distress. Because distress has externalities, we need to rein on that. And therefore, capital regulation was a simple form which would say you need to have enough capital so that if you're distressed and your portfolio goes bust, you have the capital to cushion some of those shocks. Yeah. Initially, the rules were very simple. The entire portfolio of bank would be divided, was sort of designed into 5 broad categories. And depending on where that particular loan that the bank originated would fall in, so if it's an SME loan, there would be a loan say, you know what, risk weights for this are so and so, and based on this, this is the capital you need to have for that type of risk. But something that was very simple, even anybody could do it on a pen and paper, could understand what it meant for a bank. The media could understand it, and they could, if something was not right, they could spot it. So there would be a lot of this. Then came Basel II, and a lot of players felt that finance had made a lot of progress. We actually now know how to measure risk more precisely. Instead of punishing all the loans in the portfolio by the same tax, let's call this a tax. This is like the Peruvian tax to correct for the externalities. Instead of taxing everything at the same rate, what one could do is, because we have such a good measurement of risk coming from finance theory, let's measure the risk of a particular loan and attach the capital associated with that risk. Does that make sense? So we're moving towards a more sophisticated regulation, where instead of having these 5 buckets to assign risk weights or capital, you have something called a model-based regulation. All right, a more sophisticated regulation being introduced. Okay. Now, if you look at economic theory, right, this is, this is actually pretty good, because the idea of taxing is, the entity that is polluting should be taxed. You shouldn't put a tax on others as well, on others. Okay. Now, things get a lot more messier when this whole thing can be manipulated, is going to be the argument, because these models are not law of gravity and they can be manipulated. And the idea is simply what many people in economics call the Goodhart's law, or in macroeconomics, there's a relation called the Lucas critique, which is, once the rule in place, agents are going to optimize to take advantage of the rule. And it's this optimization which will defeat the whole purpose of that rule, right? In physics, when you were studying back, for those of you from, who remember, there was something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? How many of you remember that? Right. Okay, there are a few who remember that, right? And that was like a version of that, right? It's impossible to get the exact velocity or momentum of and position of the electron at the same light, because the moment you throw the light on it to get the precisest thing, it'll impart momentum onto it and therefore the position, right? So the idea is that once we form a rule, people are going to optimize. Here we are MBAs, if you tell the MBAs that what really matters to get in are these 3 things, right? Because these 3 things have shown up in the hard information to have mattered in the data, then what will happen is people will overinvest in those 3 skills, but that may undermine the whole idea of generating future leaders, because the future leaders was not just those 3 things, but a lot of extracurriculars, etc., which were not part of that. So the moment you make something more precise, that is sort of that type of an argument, essentially. So I'll show you some graphs on what happened when this rule was implemented, and then we can talk about who the winners and losers are, and then we'll move on to the I do like to talk a lot, so one sometimes gets this thing. So is there a way to know the clock somewhere just to make sure I'm on 6:44? So I want to 7:15. Okay, very good. Then I'm on the first slide, so that's very helpful. All right. So I already talked about this whole idea of the role for capital regulation and the Peruvian tax. I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to I just remind you quickly of what I was talking about. The pre-reform framework being this simple regulatory framework, okay, where you had these 5 broad categories, and then you came up with this post-reform sophisticated model where instead of just having one model, a given bank now would be regulated by many models, and the regulator would have to approve these models. Just to give you a sense, a big, large bank like, say, the Commerce Bank would have 100+ portfolios, all of them driven by different models, had to be validated by the regulator. And then what will come out from this model is what's the risk of this particular loan and what's the capital therefore assigned to that. Okay, so pretty, wow. That's just very good. Okay, so just to give you a sense, Basel I, which is the initial simple rule, 30 pages long, only five risk weight buckets, calculating regulatory ratios possible using a pen and paper. From Basel II, 347 pages, risk weights determined by these sophisticated models that had to be proposed by the bank. So every bank has their own model. So if I give them a portfolio of loans to different banks, the same portfolio, they'll all come up with their own risk weights on it. This is how sophisticated this is, okay? And I'm just talking about risk right now. There's loss given default, correlations. This is like we're going into this territory of complexity that nobody understands. Okay. And then Basel III is sort of continuing on that trend Okay, just to give you a sense, this theme is not just for capital regulation of banks. You know, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 was pretty straightforward. The Dodd-Frank Act, if any of you have attempted to read it, I've tried it on a few occasions, and it's a perfect thing to read before going to bed because it really puts you to bed. It's so complicated that you barely can get past the first page. A lot of people talk about the Dodd-Frank Act, and I once wanted to actually go around and actually see how many people academics have read it. And you know, you'd be surprised. It's just very few. I haven't asked this question to Viracharya. He probably is the only one who's probably read it in detail because of you know, but there are not many. A lot of us who talk about the Dodd-Frank Act is just what we read from here, there, but not this is not you know coming from the real source. Anyway, the European rulemaking. So this trend towards complexity, I just want to say, is just not new. I've talked about the benign and benign view, and okay. So let me get into this. So very simply, what we want to examine why this complex regulation was introduced. What did people think was the reason for this complex regulation, this Basel II, the model-based regulation? And then look at, you know, expose who are the winners and losers from this and how we can relate it to the lobbying of these things in terms of the introduction of these rules. Okay. So a lot of people working on bankruptcy and insolvency law, I'm sure you have the same. It's probably, shows how slow I am because even the computer is like, get on with it, you know. Okay. So I will just show you 4 things in 4 graphs, and hopefully this will be quite clear. Okay, so this was precise measurement of risk, and the idea was that by being able to do it precisely, we'll be actually able to discourage risks and shift towards more safer portfolios and increase financial stability. Right, the objective out there, and because we sort of know how to measure risk precisely, we can avoid these distortions that might take place from sort of a coarse regulation, right? Coarse versus fine regulation is how you can think about this as well. All right. Now so when banks were asked, so this was an option given to, this is coming from the Bundesbank in Germany. Okay. And so I'll explain you what these different things are, be very conscious of the time as well. So, but let me just explain you what these things are. So these are what is PD out here. All right, this is at the essentially loan level. It's called the PD is the probability of default. What it measures is, these are firms they're looking at. It measures what's the probability that a firm is going to default in a year from now. All right. When the model-based regulation was introduced in different places, the way it was done was it was not forced down on the banks. So it was said, you know what, we think this is a good thing. You all have been arguing for this precise regulation, and said, how many of you want to go in for a model-based regulation? So there is something called the standard approach, which is what was the 5 buckets I talked about, and then people said, you know, how many of you want to go for this model-based regulation? And what happened was, you saw automatically out of the 1558 banks that operate in Germany, only the 45 largest banks raised their hands. We think this is a great idea, and we'd like to move towards this model-based regulation. Okay. And I want to now show you is how these 45 banks implemented this policy, reduced their capital, grew their balance sheets, and later on, what you see is, if you look at the concentration of big banks in Germany, big banks even became bigger. So here's a regulation which is intended to fix this too big to fail problem. And what it ended up doing was it ended up subsidizing size. It made big banks even bigger. And that's what I'm going to show. So this is essentially, so here's looking at these 45 banks. And so remember, 1558 banks in Germany, the largest 45 said, yes, we want to undertake it. Now, when they said yes, not everybody was allowed to shift their entire portfolio onto this model-based regulation because the regulators had to verify it. And sometimes there was not enough data, right? So all the banks want to move there as fast as possible. The regulator says, I'm okay with this particular portfolio being shifted to IRB, not this shifted to IRB. Okay, so these are just correlations that I'm going to be showing you about, and then the paper does more complicated stuff, and you've got to believe me or read the paper. Okay, but this is what it's looking at. So here's in 2008. Here's a portfolio that has moved to the when you see SA out here, you should think of SA being the simple rule, also called the standard approach. The IRB is the model-based approach. That's the sophisticated regulation. So the way you should think about this is of the portfolio that has moved. So the blue one is the standard approach, and the red one is the model-based approach, right? If you look at the probability of default out here, the way to think about this is the blue line tells us that those that are on the standard approach, because they're all providing the probability of default to these banks, 2.6% of these loans are expected to default a year from now. Whereas those that are on the IRB approach, only 1.5% of these loans are being default. Is that okay? Now, of course, there could be selection out here that, the regulator is only putting in safer portfolios earlier, so we can't really say much on that. But what we can see out here is the PD seem to suggest that year on year, the IRB loans are a lot safer. Does it make sense? Because they have a lower PD. Now, what you can do is you can actually look at the actual default rates, right? I said the PDs were 2.5%. Let me see how many of these loans are defaulting. So here's the actual default rate, which one can look at. Okay, so as you can see out here, the blue in the PDs, which are feeding into the risk weight calculation, because the lower the PD you tell, and if the regulator is okay with it, the lower the capital you need to set aside, because this is a safe loan or a safer loan. All right. Now, the actual defaults tend to tell us something else. All right. Now, you could say, listen, things can go wrong. You could have a good model, but if the macroeconomy moves in some ways, you could, a good model can sometimes look inferior, right? Or this could be a naive mistake. So you could go to the next step. Let me also show you one more thing before that. One of the RWA is just the capital that is being set aside for this stuff. Okay, the RWA seems to suggest that consistent with the lower PDs, these IRB loans are safer loans. Now, if you look at the loss rates, not only are they defaulting less, banks are making bigger losses on these loans. Okay, so what's coming out here? The IRB loans are said to be safer, they're defaulting more, and they have higher losses despite having less capital set aside. Now, one can still argue it's a naive mistake. So you can now look at, say, what are the interest rates you're charging for this? You're telling us it's a low PD loan. What is the interest rate you're charging? Because the interest rate is a sign of risk that the bank thinks aside. And if you look at the interest rate charge, while the reported PDs are not able to predict defaults, the interest rates do a very good job in predicting defaults. The point being that these banks did not think of those loans to be safe. They charged a higher interest rate, and these loans ended up being defaulted higher. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that's going on, but the point is that here's a sophisticated regulation that was used, model, okay, and was used by these large banks to move towards to take on more risk but have low capital, pushing them closer to what was privately optimal for them. Now, when you ask essentially the regulators, this is such a simple thing we did. Why did you not see it? Their complaint is we don't have enough manpower to deal with this stuff. We need more. And then what they ended up doing was they went and advertised these jobs, civil servant jobs in Germany, mathematicians, PhDs, economists being invited to come and help them assess these models because shortage of manpower has led to all this stuff. And I was trying to tell them, you need to understand the regulated are smarter than the regulators. They'll figure out a way to do it. You'll always catch it late, right? So here's an example where a sophisticated rule doesn't seem to be, at least, one could always argue that, it can do something, but I was just, trying to make this point that there are cases where simple course rules can actually be more effective. Think of speed limits, right? You could have a very complicated rule. So if you're going on, say, on a motorway in the US, it says the speed limit is 70 miles per hour for everyone. Now you can have a very good complicated rule, which could say, depending on number of hours you slept, whether you had coffee in the morning or not, how well you drive. Today your speed limit is 83 miles per hour. Today yours is only 68 miles per hour, right? And you could have a very complicated rule like that. And then I'm sure economists will come with a model and say, having this different speed limit could be welfare improving. Because what you can do is you can transport goods from A to B by hiring the most efficient driver on that day, and this will reduce the cost of labor, and they'll come up with all sorts of stuff like that. But you can see how, sometimes simple rules can do it. And so this is sort of trying to make the point of that. Okay, I should move on. Just to tell you about winners and losers from this reform, and this is just looking at big banks versus small banks. There's a bit of demeaning going on out here, but essentially what happened, which I was telling earlier, the big banks seem to have benefited from this regulation. Big banks became bigger, which was sort of counter to. Okay. Now, of course, there can be other things that they may have got it right, reduce the distortion in the cross section because these models are better, but at least just to caution against this. Okay. Now, this is from a lot of the information is also from Andy Haldane's article, who talks about in his very nice paper on Dog and the Frisbee. I think that's the title, but talking about supervision, it says, in 1970s, the Bank of England performed supervision with just 30 employees. It was quite simple. Okay. And then there's some things, now, UK regulatory now has for every 300 people employed in finance compared to 1 in 11,000 people in the industry. Okay. So just to tell you how many resources are going because of these complicated regulations and things like that. And what is happening is these are imposing these high fixed costs. A lot of, you could think of these costs as being passed on to the consumer in terms of higher prices and things like that. Okay. 1974, 150 entries. Today, that's 7,500 cells. I mean, a lot of data being reported. Nobody knows what's to do it. I put a word out here, which people have looked in corporate finance as empire building. One can think of this as regulatory empire building, because actually regulators are benefiting from this in some ways. They have sort of, so anyway, I will get on that. But the idea, just the punchline of this whole idea is that when we think about the complexity, maybe we should think of it in a different way. Maybe simplifying the rules might be more effective. And so the idea being less might be more effective. So when it comes to regulation, less or simpler rules might be more effective in as a way of governing than more complicated rules. Okay. Now, there's a power study which was also done in looking at, so this was done in Germany, but what happened was there was an establishment of what is called the SSM. This is the single supervisory mechanism, which was the centralized supranational institution I was telling you about. And what this gave an opportunity was to look at, what drives this kind of behavior. And if you bring in ECB, which is the European Central Bank, to supervise all the banks, which is, you can think of this as a standardized way of supervising banks through these models as well, right? What are the trade-offs associated with it? I won't have time to get into it, but I want to put the gist out there, which was that when you get a centralized body like that, a lot of course, people are concerned that the national supervisor is more, has more soft information, understands the local needs better, and therefore is able to tailor policies to suit the needs of the local, local tastes, etc. The supranational supervisor, ECB, may not take those things into account, may not act in the best interests out there. So there are all these things. But what we see comes out when you look at least measurement of credit risk, is that when you have a centralized authority, while it reduces regulatory capture, okay, it reduces the power of local banks to influence policy in their favor, which is what I mean by regulatory capture. There is a negative side of it, which is these models that are used to assess become less informative. So there's always this tension between losing information vis-a-vis being too close and then being captured, and those forces of capture playing in. So the optimal design, they call it the organizational design of regulation, centralized versus decentralization, is a sort of a trade-off between these types of forces, which is being close to the bank allows you to know what the problem banks are really facing. And sometimes these are shocks, macro shocks, no fault of the bank, and therefore you can help the bank better. But proximity also generates this negative side of it, which is it exposes these banks to capture. Okay, so I've mentioned this. I'm going to skip this whole. There's a big literature on that. I'm looking at the 7 7 o'clock on the clock out here, and Professor Jayadev is about to sleep as well. So I should try to rush. Okay, I was just joking, by the way. I know you're very attentive and you're listening very intently. Okay, so I talked about this, decentralization. There's a lot of, but the main results are okay. Now I will also move a bit to bankruptcy law out here because there's some of this harmonization discussion happening here as well. Okay, and the two approaches to bankruptcy law. Okay, one is sort of the freedom of contracting, the English approach, and the idea here is let's use the power of contracts. All that judges should do is enforce contracts. People should be willing to write contracts. And as long as we allow them to write contracts and the contract space is pretty decent, then people will choose what they need, and that's going to be essential. Now, the contrast approach is the US bankruptcy approach, which is more, the Chapter 11 type of a thing, which is a mandatory, so you don't even have the option of opting out of it. You can write a private contract and say, I'm not going to use Chapter 11, but the courts are not going to enforce that kind of a thing. All right. Now, so this debate on freedom of contracting versus Chapter 11 is out there. Now, Chapter 11 is justified on the ground that as corporations are getting bigger and bigger, they're more prone to creditor run type of situations. All right, and therefore a reorganization procedure is important to make sure that you don't, that the creditors don't. That doesn't lead to what are called inefficient liquidations of firms. Okay, that the liquidations sort of follow. And that's so the underlying sort of view of folks who are actually very much in the Chapter 11 type of mindset is that absent Chapter 11, you would see huge coordination problems, creditor runs, and large fire sale discounts, means assets liquidated at very low prices. Okay. Now, a lot of the debate is quite theoretical. Now, shipping is a very interesting industry. Okay, it is actually one of the oldest industries, and commercial ships, as mentioned out here, involved in the carriage of roughly 90% of global trade. And what you see out here is debt financing seems to be the dominant form of financing in the shipping industry. It's a highly leveraged industry. Now, the shipping industry actually operates on what is called the freedom of contracting regime. Part of it is because of the British influence. Okay, but things are quite complicated in this following sense. A firm in the US, as I was mentioning earlier, cannot escape the Chapter 11. You cannot write a contract around it. But when you're on international waters, right, that is there is no rule of law out there. So what you have in the shipping industry is you can have different types of bank financing a ship. You can have a contract which would say, where would you like arbitration to be there? Okay, so it's a perfect example where you could actually say, I borrow from a Scandinavian bank, we'd like arbitration in Singapore, etc., etc. And you can escape what are the local bankruptcy laws of that country. Now, this looks like an industry that has all the necessary ingredients for chaos and low level of financing. But as I said earlier, financing is quite effective. And here what you see is that this freedom of contract seems to be doing a decent job, except for the externalities of oil spills, etc., that I'll talk about, which is now coming into play. So here's a quote from Sammy Offer, one of the shipping magnate of Zimbabwe. He said, there is only one law in shipping, which is there is no law in shipping. Okay, and it's just how this industry works. But this industry, there have been a lot of calls of harmonization. Let's centralize it. So the airline industry, for example, there's a Cape Town Treaty, which sort of has something called which has these globally consistent standards on how creditor rights, issues are going to be resolved. And all countries that have signed on to that treaty have to have similar laws in terms of, what it means. Shipping, on the other hand, has resisted any of these, attempts to standardize things. And okay, as I said earlier, so in many ways, the industry functions remarkably well. There's some sort of this spontaneous order in the Hayek sense. Loan to value ratios are around 70%. The cost of financing is very low. Low level of coordination failures. They have adapted organizational form in such a way that each ships are financed as silos as opposed to a big organizational unit. So there's a lot of contractual innovation. And as I said earlier, despite the potentially chaotic environment in which the industry operates, the rule of law has been established. It's largely private, decentralized, differentiated, competitive, and adaptable. Okay, so they've figured out very innovative ways. They sometimes do struggle with, US, for example, interfering and imposing on them Chapter 11, etc. They have figured out ways around that even. Okay. Now, of course, it comes with its own externalities. What you see in the shipping industry is an extreme form of creditor rights. Okay, creditor rights are very strong because what's happening is that ports to attract business, because the way things work in the shipping industry, and I don't have much time, but maybe we can talk in the PhD session in more detail with students. But the way it works is that ports compete to get business because the way to liquidate is by arresting ships. Okay, and this competition between ports has generated very strong creditor rights. You can actually arrest a vessel and liquidate it within few days. Okay, the bright side of having strong creditor rights in this setting is you get financing very easily because creditors know that if there's something they need to call the Admiralty Marshal out there will arrest it, sell it, and there are quick ways of getting done. Ex ante, this means a lot of financing. But strong credit rights also generates these negative externalities, which is when firms are near distress, they start under-maintaining their assets. Under-maintenance of distressed ships generates higher oil spills in the data. So when we look at this, distressed firms are more likely to generate oil spills because they don't take these externalities into account. There are also other things such as labor abandonment in ports and things like that. So what you see now is the freedom of contract seems to be doing a decent job in terms of in situations where firms are small, when there are these externalities involved, then there is a role for sort of government intervention, and then it depends on what happens. Okay, so last few minutes I'm going to spend this thing on. We've talked about these complex rules and all this stuff. Understand where do these rules really come from? And I've already given you a lot of the punchline in the introduction on, looking at Basel rules. Okay, so the setting is essentially capital regulation again, bank regulation out here. And I had mentioned earlier, there are these, national regulators of different countries sit together. There's some 30 odd countries, they sit together and they discuss what are the rules we need to implement to improve the financial stability on the whole. And they debate about this. And then what they do is they come up with, here's what we need to do. We need to regulate banks. And then what they come out is they come up with a consultative document. And then the industry has time to comment on it. All right, so the industry will then talk about, whether this makes sense or not. And based on that, these folks vote. All right, and after the vote is done, then either it gets implemented or it doesn't get implemented. That's sort of the procedure for it. All right. Now, so we're going to try and see how these rules being done. We're going to try and systematically understand what's really, how the international, standard setting is taking place, how these rules being made. How do national regulators form their position, and how is this an outcome of optimization, etc. Why do some rules get done? Why are some discarded? And what ends up being the kind of rules that are implemented? Okay, so here are some examples of a speech before the consultative document, just to give you a sense of how things are. This is an important person, doesn't matter. But it says, I fully agree with the leverage ratio's overall intention. This is what they had proposed. They came out and said, we really have to do this to deliver transparent and credible ratio, complementing the risk-based capital requirements. Commerce Bank and others came in, firing. This makes no sense at all. How could you say such a thing? This is what he says after the document is released. Yet a leverage issue would create the wrong incentives. I don't think it's the right thing to do. All right. Here's another example of that. Andrew Bailey before the consultative document. Okay. The post-crisis adjustment of capital adequacy standards are welcome and a necessary correction. After the consultative document is released and people have it is sometimes said that the banking system still needs markedly more capital. I don't agree with either of these positions, nor would I say most supervisors I know. Okay, so this is how they are before proposed, gets pushed, and then their stance changes. And you have lots of examples of these speeches that they've made and stuff like that. And we've looked at textual analysis to figure out how the tone changes, how they shift from this and that. Okay, now I'll show you. What's interesting out here is that there are big banks in the economy who voice their concerns about any regulation. So in general, banks are always opposed to regulation. That's in the data. That's not, I don't get any, credit for that. You get that quite clear. Banks in general are opposed to it. Okay. Now, regulators want this to be done because they think about financial stability, but they have this tension in their mind. On one hand, they want to promote financial stability, but they don't want to come up with rules which hurt their national champions because they're also in a competitive atmosphere, right? So they're sort of optimizing based on these things. So they have fed this information. We want this ratio works for us, but this does not. If you're doing the stress test, these are the dimensions on which stress test is okay for us, but this is not, right? So they're trying to, right? But in the end, the voting pattern suggests that even though we want to harmonize, what gets implemented is the lowest common denominator because you require unanimity. So the harmonization, while it's good in terms of the externality, etc., not much gets implemented. And therefore, what we get is almost regulations that are very, 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 very straightforward. So here the two things that I'll show you, which will summarize this, and then we can break. Okay, so here's the vote in favor of regulation, and then we've also got some textual analysis looking at speech and how they actually change their opinion, how they're more sympathetic, and how their speech is correlated with those of national champions, etc. So here's saying, in general, favor, positive correlation here just seems that tell you that the votes are very much in sync with what the national champions want. Okay. Now, there are two types of policies, one that have a differential impact. So different banks are saying different things in different countries. So you see on regulations that don't have a differential impact, there's no effect. But when there is a differential impact, you see the same idea that they're actually, position of national champions is very much correlated with that of the national champions. We come to the issue that this might be optimal. What's wrong with that? The national champions are conveying some information, and you must take them into account because they actually know this better, and I will talk about this. Now, here is position of small banks. So the way the small banks convey their issue, for example, in this model-based regulation that I talked about, right? In US, this was not implemented. They said we're not going to go for it because the small banks said this is a fixed cost regulation which will affect market structure in this negative way. In Europe, it went ahead with it. Okay, so the way the small banks express this, because they're too small, they do it through a union. So there's a union of small banks who then expresses their vote or their concerns, stuff like that. And what you can see out here is that the position of national, while it's positively correlated with the positions of national champions, it's not correlated with the position of small banks. Okay. Oh gosh. Yeah. Now, what is quite interesting is that even though the small banks in many countries have a much larger market share, they have 70% of the share is small banks. Still, it's the position of the national champions which tends to matter out here. Okay, I think I have run out of time, but let me just take 1 or 2 minutes to conclude. I've already mentioned this field hockey stuff, so that was great timing. So I actually don't want to get into that again. But what comes out of it is just to sort of complete the picture is that it seems like the way the voting is being done, is being catered to the national champions. Now, is there some stuff on revolving door of regulators, how incentives of regulators are shaped, etc., and how that affects the voting patterns? There's more to it. in the paper. But what I've actually tried to do in sort of in this one patchy presentation that I said earlier is to give you this idea of regulation, the complexity of it, what's driving it, and how to think about lobbying and the political economy side of it in terms of what affects it. And the hockey is an example very close to my heart. So a lot of people in my speeches I use this example, but it's a very classic thing of how an innocuous regulation actually can have these huge effects. We hope India will be a superpower in hockey at some point, but it will take some time. So I'm going to stop out here and we can take some questions if that's what you have. Yeah. I'll be, is that okay? Yeah.
Brilliant presentation, very impressed. I had a question. Was just the benefit of those who are online.
My question is that was self-regulation already dead when Basel II came, or did self-regulation become a victim of this whole web of regulations? Is there any way where there would be some respect and recognition for self-regulation going forward?
For banks, you mean bankers? I don't think it works. Yeah. So in general, yes. I mean, in some sense, you could think about the model-based regulation as a movement towards self-regulation, because these are models that are being proposed by the banks, and the only thing the regulator is doing is verifying it by checking whether you've done it correctly. So this was a move in that direction, and it actually backfired. I don't want to say too much about, too much negative about banks or bankers right now, but I there's a paper I've written on India on organizational design of state banks. And what came out very interesting in that was also I was looking at this decision of centralization versus decentralization. And we've done a cross-sectional test in states based on some ranking of the corruption. There's a corruption index which ranks BIMARU states in a different way compared to the other states. And it was looking at, what's the benefit of decentralization. And there were some experiments which are carried out by banks where where they were able to decentralize it, and decentralized did not work in corrupt states. And the idea was, while decentralized has this positive effect of generating information, it actually was harmful in corrupt environments where there is lots of scope for abuse of discretion. Let's put it this way. Now, when I look at banking industry in general, there's another stuff I've looked at in Germany, because I'm going back to your question on self-regulation. Banking industry seems to be something to do with, there's a paper I've looked on in the context of bank bailouts. Somehow, I just want to make sure I don't say the wrong thing, because I'm being recorded and stuff like that. And these days things just get, but let me just not say too much. Self-regulation doesn't, the incentive of bankers are a bit different. So, sorry? Right. Had to be bailed out because a lot of money, public money was in.
Public money was involved in Yes Bank, and it was self-regulated with a lot of issues. And in fact, it has had a fallback on RBL promoter, who has done nothing but has been terminated without any notice.
Okay, so you've got a better answer there.
Sudhaker Bank CEO was terminated on a 12-hour notice.
Yeah.
Sir, by regulators. As you said, sir, maybe with a very crisp and but a detailed presentation, You have shown us that pressure groups are there in policy making, which are basically elites, maybe the big ones in the nation.
Yeah.
So how does a rule maker or a regulator take care of these pressure groups in policy making for general interest?
Yeah, so this is where I was trying to tie in the organization of regulation, the organizational design of regulation in that context, and taking away essentially sometimes, how do we, if we think this is a big problem, that the elites are affecting decision making, right? The more centralized the decision making gets, right? So there's a lot of design, design issues that can be implemented in that regard, like in the context of Germany, when the bailout is done at the very decentralized level, the politician has a lot of influence in getting the funds, and that has bad effects on banks. They came up with a state level association where the team was formed of multiple individuals from different counties in that state. And all of them had to vote for the bailout to happen. And that was already a more complicated thing because you could influence your own local politician, but you could not influence that well the other politicians who would then have to pay for it. So I think there's an interesting research question out there, which is how does one design, it's more of a mechanism design type of an approach. How does one design a system like that where the decision making is either through centralization or the structure of committees in such a way that there is no there is more independence in this. And Europe's experiment of supranational institutions is effectively, maybe this is not their intention directly, but it is taking away control. And you could argue that Brexit, one of the concerns that a lot of people have with, say, Brexit type decisions is we want control. Now, why do we want so much control could be viewed in different ways. One could be that, you're making decisions that are not right for us, and we need control to make our own decisions, which is the right side of it. But the other is that you're also going to be more prone to being controlled. So if you talk to a lot of Greeks, Greek citizens, they say we actually like the EU because we don't trust our own politicians, right? So there's some folks who are actually benefiting from this because they know their hands are tied. The local politicians cannot now do this thing because it's EU now in play. But British felt differently, and they voted for Brexit again. That's the nature, but that's a way of thinking about it.
In India,
Sir, one question. I just want to. You have made a detailed presentation on the complexity of that financial regulation, and also you have not presented any impact whether by graduating from a simple method to complex method, whether our financial regulations and actually improved or not. Before the Basel implementation in 91, we had only a small bank failure, very small scale of security scam of 5,000 crore rupees. When we switched over to Basel 1, there was a Ketan Parekh 1 lakh crore rupees. Now after the Basel 2, when we are implementing, even in the process of implementing, still not fully implemented, we have seen so many banks forced to declare losses. Public sector banks declared losses, resulting in a complete erosion of the network. What was the regulation doing? What was the regulator doing? Regulations has helped only certain group of professionals to get into a job. It has not helped the banking system. Keep the system very simple. It is acceptable to everybody. Today, problem is, I have seen in the bank, I have worked in the bank myself, there are two types of professionals in the bank. One is non-IT banking professionals. One banking non-IT professionals. So that those who have got no IT background, they are banking professionals. Then there are IT professionals.
Can you make it
there is no correlation under that. Person who sits in that sanctioning loan, he does not understand that risk management.
Excuse me, sir.
He does not understand risk management, and the person who understands risk management does not understand how
we can have discussion at the dinner time also. So
okay,
and we can continue this discussion at the dinner. He will be here.
No, what I just wondered whether you have done any study to come out whether it has resulted in a better management or not. I just wanted to keep it simple.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a good point. But so there's no specific. I mean, see, the thing is that there's always a trade-off, right? You can have a very safe banking system which doesn't give credit to anyone, right? And then it's no defaults and no growth, and that is also, so just totally avoiding any risk is also not the right thing, right? But you're right in saying that, things, there have been more events and, I think the right way to think about this, I don't know what the optimal level of default is. It's definitely not zero. And the art of the ability to take risks will entail some defaults, right? And maybe we are better off with that risk because as a society we have more people are growing, and there's going to be some losses, but maybe that was too inefficient, you could argue. Yeah, we can take 2 questions.
I'll just reply to your question. Public sector banks had losses of about 12 lakh crores. About 12 lakh crores. Out of 12 lakh crores, 7 to 8 lakh crores can be attributed to reasons which are not under the control of the public sector banks. Now, public sector banks did not cancel coal licenses for the last 20 years. Now, they gave loans based on those coal licenses. They did not know that coal licenses will be cancelled for 20 years. Public sector banks, I have not worked in a bank. I'm not a banker. Public sector banks.
You are in DFS.
Public sector banks did not cancel 2G and 3G licenses given in the past several years. Public sector banks did not ban mining in Karnataka. You know that mining was banned in Karnataka for a very long time. And because mining was banned in Karnataka for a very long time, so road traffic in Karnataka got reduced for several years. And this led to sickness in several road projects in Karnataka. Now, public sector banks should not be blamed for really everything. That's first point that I want to make. Second point I want to make is, yes, what could the regulator again do? Regulator was doing as much as perhaps the regulator could do. But what could the regulator do if there are extraneous factors which are not under control of either the regulator or the public sector bank? So why didn't the private sector banks get disturbed? This is a subject very, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, last question. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a specific question about the political economy of financial regulation. What do you think about this trend of using financial regulation, for instance, in the European Union, to use capital requirements as a channel or as a way to achieve other political goals, for instance, the fight against climate change, particularly the green supporting factor, these type of proposals that try to canalize or drive some finance in the financial sector through green assets instead of brown assets, but using capital requirements.
You mean whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or?
Yeah, what are your views on that?
That's a very difficult question to. I can only talk about trade-offs in general, which is what we're good at, without examining it. It all depends on what your view on this green revolution is, right? The whole idea is to provide some sort of incentives, and if encouraging banks through this channel, because I always think about capital requirements in some sense as a tax, okay? Because without it, firms would operate at different, so I always call it a Pigouvian tax to shift banks to what the regulators wanted to be socially optimal. And then changing the tax rates is a subsidy or a further tax. So in that sense, the economics is quite easy because you can incentivize it by providing a subsidy, or you can penalize it by providing a higher tax rate, right? So that part is quite easy to understand. And so you say, what, should I provide this subsidy or not through the capital requirements? I'm sure there are other ways of doing it than doing it this way. This looks like a pretty indirect, doesn't look like an obvious way of subsidizing it. I don't know of a study that has looked at it or anything like that. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for this interesting presentation. May I now request Sudhaker, sir, full-time member IDBI, to please deliver their special remarks.
So my job is basically to give some special remarks before a special dinner is served. So time at the dot, we are at 7:30. So, and I thank Professor Vivek for this wonderful exposition. Actually, we were learning more during the process of what he was delivering. So I was also very intensely trying to see as a regulator where more improvement are needed in our systems. So I would be taking only very brief points about a few takeaways, basically, again, political economy approach, rule making, that part has been touched, that I don't want to repeat in that sense. But few points I thought which are coming from his wonderful disposition today. One is basically comes from what about complexity and what should be the consensus making process. So in international regime, which has been talked about, financial instruments are very fluid and maturing. Your hybrid innovations in financial instruments is coming in leaps and bounds. So complexities will remain. And so is the case with the insolvency law. If you see internationally, we say unilateral, it has been referred, tries to manage to build some kind of harmonization to bring some, rather all the regimes, jurisdictions dealing with the insolvency space to be at one place. But unilateral rightly all the time, because there is a not only complexity but also level of development of various jurisdiction is different. So it always says it's a model law, and model law gives some flexibility whether to adopt it or not first. And if you adopt it also, then there is a question with what kind of flexibility. So that is inbuilt in the model laws. Like cross-border has been spelled in the morning session also, in the inaugural session, and in his lecture as well. Cross-border, if you see, has got tremendous response just after the 2008 contagion. Lot many jurisdictions adopted it, and in all we have 57 jurisdictions now. And if we see, go deeper, deep dive will indicate that out of the 57 jurisdictions, each and every jurisdiction has made amendments or made some tailor-made adjustments in the law to suit the national law and national requirements. So it is not that model law is ready, I say tick box, yes, and we go through. So if you say in the cross-border, if you see Korean example and you see the Japanese example, it would be very difficult to say that they have adopted the model law, but they have adopted the model law. If you see US and UK, maybe they have some right to say that they have adopted the model law and implemented the model law. So this complexity across 57 jurisdictions has not been well researched actually to see that the benefits are automatically understood and implemented across the jurisdictions. Second development under UNICETROL was basically they came up with a group insolvency regime. To my information, not a single jurisdiction has signed it. But if you are not signing this enterprise group insolvency, then how you will make cross-border insolvency more potent and efficient in delivery? That is the question actually. And when we are debating how to implement the law in the context of this country, we are faced with challenges and questions which we are looking forward to various kind of discussions, inputs, how to take this regime forward. And the third aspect which is being discussed under UNICETROL is it relates to basically not UNICETROL, it's a UNIDROIT principles are being deliberated on how digital assets are to be acknowledged within the insolvency regime. Again, when a country has a different kind of orientation towards the digital currency, cryptocurrency is no-go area in many jurisdictions. People are discussing, even today in G20 meet, this is a discussion topic in Bangalore itself, which is happening. Finance ministers are meeting here, decided in the newspaper. So this is under discussion and it is a work in progress. So I thought this is how consensus building and complexity pose challenges in the different regimes under insolvency. The second issue I thought was of relevance about probability of default. Some case studies have been shown that results are not good enough to give you confidence that modeling in this sphere is good to carry on. But resolvability framework to trace the imminent default and to follow on those defaults is not a rocket science. I thought it does not need such a extensive modeling. So imminent default is still being discussed. It is under the drawing board because our code starts with default. We don't talk about imminent default, but someday as jurisdictions mature and we mature as a credible insolvency jurisdiction, we will be also talking about the resolvability framework which UK has so successfully implemented. Then we have like striking punch line was less is more. And actually this is what we are trying to propagate all the time, that we as a regulator need flexibility and regulatory sandbox. Not like if you have a codified everything, then things come to say downhill journey if systems are not responding in a manner in which you thought it would be responding. So that regulatory sandbox giving more flexibility to regulator perhaps can be one way to move forward. But this is also prone to danger in the sense which he was hinting also in this question, also on the regulatory capture. And regulatory capture is a real threat in true sense in each jurisdiction. But if you see what we did to counter this, we have made regulation to how to make regulation. So it is on our website, it's a regulatory practice. It is followed in each and every regulation which we brought out. We get the stakeholders discussion, we get the public comments, but getting is like still you can say you have not sorted out the ones which are against you and you have just taken the few. No. On the website, before going for the regulation, we have to give the analysis of all the comments, what has gone in and what has remained out and why. So at least public at large knows what has happened and why their inputs, which were so credible as he thought, could not go into the regulatory practice. So this is, I thought, very important aspect which he touched upon. Then we have heard a bit of enforcing the contract, a little bit of economics. I thought when we talk about evolving law, we always hide behind Oliver Hart's hypothesis about incomplete law, incomplete contract. So that complexity is inbuilt in the contract itself. So how to make the contract simpler, readable, and without challenge is an issue again each and every jurisdiction is facing. It is not this Nobel laureate came from different jurisdiction after analysis of so many jurisdictions that this is how contracts world over are being designed. So these design principles have to simplify actually to move forward. And last point I want to say, and I hope my chairperson was not listening intently, but he said that regulators should have lean and thin body. So we thought with around 60 strong staffs, we were lean and thin and we were trying to strive to expand. But I thought you gave some right signals that it is not the quantity, but quality is important and we have to strive for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for the concluding remarks. May I please request Professor Jayadev to present the memento to Professor Vikrant.